wind down tonight with a story that will quiet your racing mind and ease you into peaceful sleep. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the gentle crackle of the fireplace carry you back to 1944, where we meet Charles Chappell, a fighter pilot whose final mission would haunt him in ways no training could have prepared him for. The darkness pressed against Charles Chappell's eyelids like velvet, but sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. Not since he'd returned from what everyone was calling his final mission. The other pilots in the barracks breathed deeply around him, lost in dreams that probably didn't include the sound of engines failing or the sight of parachutes that never opened. But Charles lay there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of wings he was no longer allowed to carry. It had been 3 days since he'd landed his P-51 Mustang for the last time, 3 days since the flight surgeon had grounded him permanently, and 3 days since he'd been trying to understand why his hand still shook when he thought about what he'd seen over enemy territory. What he'd been forced to do. What he'd chosen not to do. Take a deep breath. Let yourself sink deeper into this story, feeling the cool night air of that English airfield, the safety of being far from the chaos Charles has just experienced. The mission, his final mission, had started like so many others. Pre-dawn briefing in the operations room, coffee that tasted like burnt tree bark, the familiar ritual of checking his parachute, his oxygen mask, his sidearm. The same jokes from the same pilots, nervous laughter covering nervous fear. The same prayers mumbled under breath as they walked out to their aircraft. His Mustang, Buckeye Belle, had been waiting for him in the pre-dawn darkness, her aluminum skin slick with English dew. She was beautiful, sleek and deadly, with a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that could push her through the sky at over 400 miles per hour. He'd named her after a girl back home, though truth be told, he could barely remember what Sarah looked like now. The war had a way of making everything from before seem like a half-remembered dream. They were escorting B-17 flying fortresses on a bombing mission to aircraft factories somewhere in occupied France. It should have been routine. The German Luftwaffe was getting weaker every month, their experienced pilots dead or captured, their fuel supplies running low. Intelligence said they might not even encounter enemy fighters. It was supposed to be a milk run. But Charles should have known better. In war, it was always the milk runs that went wrong. The formation climbed steadily eastward, rising above the English Channel in the growing daylight. Below them, the water was gray-green and choppy, dotted with white caps that looked like tiny flowers from 20,000 feet. Charles checked his instruments, oil pressure good, fuel flow normal, engine temperature in the green. Everything normal, everything routine, everything exactly as it had been on dozens of previous missions, until they crossed the French coast. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, Captain Morrison's voice crackled through Charles's headset. Looks like a dozen of them. Focke-Wulf 190s. Charles looked where Morrison was pointing and felt his stomach tighten. The German fighters were diving toward the bomber formation with aggressive tactics that suggested these weren't the inexperienced pilots intelligence had promised. These were veterans. All flights, this is Falcon Leader, Morrison's voice was calm. We have company. Maintain formation and watch your targets. Remember, our job is to protect the bombers, not to be heroes. But Charles was already thinking about being a hero. At 23, with 15 confirmed kills and a chest full of medals, he was one of the squadron's experienced pilots. Flying and fighting had become as natural to him as walking or breathing. He was good at it, and he knew he was good at it. Feel your breathing slow as we follow Charles through these familiar routines, the way preparation becomes a kind of meditation. The air battle began with Morrison peeling off to intercept the lead German fighter. Charles followed, his Mustang responding to every movement of the controls. The orderly formation dissolved into a swirling dogfight spread across miles of sky. Charles had been in air battles before, but this one felt different. The German pilots were aggressive but disciplined, working in pairs to isolate individual American fighters while others slashed through the bomber formation. These weren't desperate, poorly trained pilots. These were professionals that he locked onto a Focke-Wulf lining up on a damaged B-17. Charles pushed his Mustang into a dive, building speed, his gun sight centered on the enemy fighter's engine cowling. At 400 yards, he squeezed the trigger. .650 caliber machine guns erupted in his wings. Charles could see his round sparkling off the Focke-Wulf's fuselage. Then suddenly the enemy aircraft rolled over and dove away, trailing black smoke. Charles followed, firing again. The Focke-Wulf's engine exploded in orange flame, and the aircraft fell toward the French countryside. 16 kills, but there was no time to celebrate. The bombers were taking heavy casualties. 3 B-17s were already falling behind, their engines damaged, formations broken. One was spinning toward Earth with most of its tail shot away, tiny figures tumbling from its bomb bay, crew members choosing to jump rather than ride their aircraft into the ground. ****. Then Charles saw something that made his blood freeze. ****. One of the damaged B-17s was under attack by 2 German fighters. But these weren't the gray-green Focke-Wulfs he'd been fighting. These were sleek, silver aircraft that moved through the air with supernatural speed and grace. Charles had heard rumors of German jet fighters, but he'd never seen one. Now, watching these aircraft slash through the sky at impossible speeds, he understood why Allied intelligence was worried. The B-17 didn't have a chance. The jets made pass after pass, their cannon shells tearing through the bomber's aluminum skin like paper. Within seconds, the B-17's right wing was on fire, and Charles could see crew members jumping, their parachutes blossoming white against blue sky. That he pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the burning bomber, hoping to drive off the jets, but he was too far away and too slow. By the time he reached the area, the B-17 was gone, and the jet fighters had disappeared. One of the parachutes was drifting toward the French countryside below. Charles could see the airman hanging beneath it, could make out his leather jacket and oxygen mask. The man was alive and would probably survive if he could avoid German ground troops, but as Charles watched, one of the silver jets reappeared, climbing toward the parachuting airman with deadly intent. Breathe deeply and let the tension of this moment wash over you without disturbing your growing peace. Charles had heard stories of German pilots shooting parachuting Allied airmen, but he'd hoped they were propaganda. Now, watching the jet line up on the helpless parachutist, he realized some stories were true. The jet opened fire. Charles saw the parachutist jerk as bullets found their mark, saw the white canopy shred and collapse, saw the man fall the last 1,000 feet with nothing to slow his descent. The jet pulled away, leaving Charles to watch the tiny figure impact in a French wheat field. Rage filled Charles like a red tide. This wasn't combat, this was murder. Shooting a helpless parachutist was a war crime, a violation of every code governing aerial warfare. The man in that parachute had been defenseless, entitled to be treated as a prisoner if captured. Charles rolled his Mustang over and dove after the retreating jet, his engine screaming at maximum power. The German pilot saw him coming and accelerated, but Charles was flying with fury now, somehow closing the gap. The jet pilot made a mistake. He turned to fight instead of running. Perhaps overconfident, perhaps thinking a prop-driven fighter couldn't threaten his advanced aircraft. He pulled into a tight turn and came back at Charles, cannon shells flashing from his nose. Charles saw the muzzle flashes and rolled right, feeling German shells pass through the space his aircraft had occupied. The jet flashed past, already turning for another pass, but Charles was turning too, pulling his fighter through a maneuver impossible in a heavier aircraft. The Mustang was older technology, but lighter and more maneuverable. In a turning fight, Charles had the advantage, and he pressed it ruthlessly. Each time Finally, the German pilot made the fatal error of trying to climb away. Jets were fast in level flight and dives, but vulnerable during climbs when their engines couldn't provide enough thrust for both speed and altitude. Charles followed the jet up, his Merlin engine pulling his fighter higher, closing distance as the German aircraft struggled to climb. At 800 yards, Charles opened fire. His bullet sparkled off the jet's silver skin. The German rolled left, but Charles anticipated the move and adjusted his aim. His next burst caught the jet's right engine, and Charles saw metal pieces spinning away. The jet's climb faltered. Charles closed for the kill. At 300 yards, he fired again, aiming for the cockpit. His bullets shattered the jet's canopy and punched through the armor behind the pilot's seat. The German aircraft rolled over and dove toward Earth, trailing fire and smoke. 17 kills, but as Charles watched the jet spiral down, he realized something inside him had changed forever. The German pilot tried to bail out. Charles saw the canopy fly away, saw the pilot struggle to climb from his cockpit as his aircraft fell. For a moment, the pilot was halfway out, his parachute pack visible, his arms waving as he fought the slipstream. Charles had a choice. Military protocol was clear. Once an enemy pilot attempted to bail out, he was considered out of the fight. Shooting at pilots trying to escape was a war crime, no different from what the German jet had done to the American parachutist. Instead, Charles dove after the falling jet and opened fire again. Let the weight of Charles's choice settle over you like a heavy blanket, adding to the depth of sleep that surrounds you. His bullets caught the German pilot as he climbed from his cockpit. The man's body jerked once, then went limp, falling back into his aircraft as the jet continued its death dive. Charles followed down, watching it impact in a French pasture in a ball of flame and smoke. There was no parachute, no survivor. Just fire and twisted metal, and Charles Chappell, circling overhead, trying to understand what he had just become. What Charles didn't know was that this moment would define the rest of his life. Charles rejoined the bomber formation in time to escort the remaining B-17s home. The air battle was over, the German fighters shot down or driven off, but the cost had been high. 7 bombers lost, 70 men dead or missing, and Charles couldn't stop thinking about the German pilot he'd murdered as the man tried to escape his burning aircraft, because that's what it had been, murder. Not combat, not self-defense, but cold-blooded execution. The German pilot had been out of the fight, trying to save his life, entitled under warfare rules to be treated as a prisoner if captured. Charles had killed him anyway, not in battle's heat but in calculated revenge. The flight back to England was the longest 2 hours of Charles's life. He flew formation mechanically, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing the German pilot's face in those final seconds, kept wondering if the man had understood he was about to die not as a warrior but as a victim of murder. Feel yourself drifting deeper as Charles's memories wash over you, distant now, like events from a dream you're beginning to forget. When they landed, Charles went through familiar post-mission routines. He signed off his aircraft, attended debriefing, filled out required paperwork documenting his kills. He ate dinner in the officers' mess, accepted congratulations on his 17th kill, but through it all, he felt like he was watching someone else. The real Charles Chappell was somewhere else, standing in that French pasture beside jet wreckage, staring at the body of a man he'd murdered. That night, lying in his bunk, Charles discovered sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the German pilot trying to escape his burning aircraft. Every time he started to drift off, he heard his own machine guns firing into a helpless man. Every time he turned over, he felt the weight of wings that no longer felt like they belonged to him. The next morning, Charles reported to the flight surgeon and requested to be grounded. He told the doctor he was experiencing fatigue, stress, difficulty sleeping, all true, though not complete truth. Just one more mission, Captain Chappell, the doctor said. Then you can go home with your medals and your 17 kills. But Charles shook his head. I can't fly anymore. Document something's wrong with me. The flight surgeon studied Charles, seeing something in the young pilot's eyes he'd seen too many times before. What happened up there yesterday, Charles? Charles wanted to tell him. Wanted to confess what he'd done, explain how war had changed him from someone who fought to protect people into someone who killed helpless enemies for revenge. Instead, he said, I can't do it anymore. I'm done. The flight surgeon made notes, asked questions about sleep and stress, then signed papers grounding Charles permanently. Combat fatigue, he wrote. Pilot is unfit for further operational flying. 3 weeks later, an intelligence officer approached Charles with a folder marked Top Secret. Captain Chappell. I have something about that jet fighter you shot down. Charles's stomach clenched. What about it? The officer spread photographs across the table. We sent a team to examine the wreckage. Found some interesting things. The first photo showed the burned jet remains. But other photos showed details Charles hadn't seen from the air, personal items from the cockpit, documents, and most disturbing, a small leather wallet containing photographs. The pilot's name was Hauptmann Klaus Weber, the officer said, pointing to a German ID card. 26 years old, from Munich. Been flying jets about 6 months. Charles stared at the ID, seeing the face of the man he'd killed for the first time. Weber looked younger than Charles, with fair hair and serious eyes. He could have been anyone, a teacher, a farmer, a shop clerk drafted into the Luftwaffe. That's not the interesting part, the officer continued, pulling out another photograph. Look at this. The second photo showed Weber's wallet contents, German marks, official papers, and a small black and white photograph of a woman holding a baby. The woman was smiling, and the baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. His wife and child. According to documents we found, the baby was born just before Weber transferred to the jet squadron. He'd never seen his son except in photographs. Let the sadness in this revelation wash over you without disturbing your growing drowsiness, like rain on a window while you rest safely inside. Charles stared at Weber's family picture, feeling sick. The woman looked happy, proud of her baby, probably excited her husband was flying Germany's newest aircraft. She had no idea her husband would never come home, that her son would grow up fatherless, that a stranger from Ohio had murdered the most important person in her world. There's more, the officer said, pulling out a letter in German. Our translator says this is a letter Weber was writing to his wife. Never got to finish it. Charles took the translated letter with trembling hands. Weber's words, written hours before his death, were painfully ordinary. My dearest Anna, I hope this letter finds you and little Klaus well. The weather here has been terrible, rain for 3 days, but at least it's kept us from flying much. I know you worry about me, but please don't. I'm being careful, and this new aircraft is so fast the Americans can't catch me. I should be home on leave next month, and I can hardly wait to hold my son for the first time. Kiss him for me every night and tell him his papa loves him. The letter ended there, unfinished, never sent. Charles read it 3 times, trying to reconcile the man who'd written those words with the enemy pilot he'd killed. This wasn't a fanatical Nazi or war criminal. This was a young father, missing his family, trying to survive long enough to see his son grow up. Why are you showing me this? Charles asked. The officer shrugged. Thought you had a right to know who you killed. Charles walked outside into the cool English evening, trying to process what he'd learned. Klaus Weber, 26, from Munich. A husband and father who'd written love letters and probably talked about his son with fellow pilots. A man who died trying to escape his burning aircraft while Charles shot him down like a wounded animal. Charles sat down heavily beside the operations building and put his head in his hands. Rough day. Captain Morrison approached, looking tired and worn by months of combat flying. You could say that. Charles gestured toward the building. Intelligence just showed me personal things about that German pilot I shot down. His name was Klaus Weber. He had a baby son he'd never seen. Morrison sat down facing Charles. Want to know something that might make you feel worse? Not particularly. That American parachutist the German jet shot. I knew him. Sergeant Billy Thompson from Kansas. 21, married his high school sweetheart before shipping out. She's pregnant with their first child. Charles looked up sharply. How do you know that? Because I was the one who recommended him for aerial gunner school. Because I wrote the letter to his wife telling her he was missing in action. They sat in silence, two men carrying the weight of specific deaths, specific families destroyed by war's randomness. So what do we do with this? Charles asked. How do we live with knowing good people died because of choices we made? Morrison lit a cigarette. We carry it. We remember them. We try to be better men because of what they cost us. Does it get easier? No. But it gets different. The pain doesn't go away, but you learn to function despite it. You learn to honor the dead by living well. Feel the shared understanding between these warriors like a warm embrace, their bond across darkness and loss. Charles thought about Klaus Weber's unfinished letter, about Billy Thompson's pregnant wife, about families on both sides dealing with loss and grief. I keep thinking about Weber's son, Charles said. He's going to grow up without a father because of something I did. The same right Weber had when he shot at Billy Thompson in his parachute. War gives us all the right to make terrible choices, Charles. It doesn't give us the right to feel good about them afterward. So what happens now? I go home and pretend none of this happened. You go home and remember all of this. You get married and have children and make sure they grow up in a world where they don't have to make the choices we've made. You honor Klaus Weber and Billy Thompson by being the kind of man they would have been if they'd lived. Charles nodded slowly. The war had made him a killer, but it didn't have to make him a monster. The choices he'd made didn't have to define his life, but they would always be part of him. I want to write a letter, Charles said suddenly. To who? To Weber's wife. To tell her how her husband died. Not the official version, but the truth. Morrison studied Charles. That's dangerous. If the army finds out you're corresponding with enemy families, I don't care about the army anymore. I care about a woman in Munich who's never going to see her husband again because of something I did. She deserves to know the truth. What truth? That you murdered her husband. The blunt words hit like a slap, but Charles didn't flinch. Yes. That I killed him when he was trying to escape, and that I'm sorry, and that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy he deserved but didn't get. Morrison was quiet for a long time. That's a heavy burden. Are you sure you can carry it? Charles thought about Klaus Weber's unfinished letter, about the baby who would never know his father, about the woman who would spend years waiting for a husband who was never coming home. I have to try. 3 days later, Charles mailed his letter to Anna Weber in Munich, not knowing if it would reach her, not knowing what she would think of the American pilot who had killed her husband and then written to apologize. The letter Charles wrote to Anna Weber was the hardest thing he'd ever done. He wrote it 7 times before he was satisfied, and even then wasn't sure he was saying what needed to be said. How do you explain to a woman that you killed her husband? How do you apologize for making her a widow and her child an orphan? Settle deeper into this story like sinking into a warm bath, letting Charles's struggle with conscience carry you toward peaceful sleep. Charles decided to tell the simple truth. He identified himself as the American pilot who had shot down her husband's aircraft, explained the circumstances without trying to justify his actions, and offered sincere regret for the pain he had caused. He told her about finding Klaus's letter in the wreckage, about learning Klaus had never seen his son, about the photographs that had made her husband's death personal and real. I cannot ask for your forgiveness, Charles wrote, because what I did was unforgivable. But I want you to know that your husband's death weighs on my conscience every day, and that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be a better man because of what he cost me to learn about myself. Charles mailed the letter through Red Cross channels, hoping it would find its way to Anna Weber despite wartime chaos. He had no idea if she was alive, if she was still in Munich, if she would want to hear from the man who had killed her husband. Weeks passed without response, and Charles began to think his letter had been lost. Then, just as he was beginning his journey home to Ohio, a letter arrived addressed to Captain Charles Chappell, United States Army Air Forces. The return address was Munich, Germany, and the handwriting was careful and feminine. Let the anticipation of Anna's response draw you deeper into the story, like waiting for dawn after a long night. Anna Weber's letter was written in careful English, obviously translated from German. Dear Captain Chappell, I received your letter about my husband Klaus. I was surprised to hear from you. I thought American pilots did not think about the German pilots they killed. I was wrong. You ask for forgiveness, but I do not know if I can give this to you. Klaus is dead, and our son will never know his father, and these things cannot be changed. But I want you to know that I do not hate you. Klaus died in war, fighting for his country, as you were fighting for yours. War makes enemies of people who might have been friends in another time. I want to tell you about Klaus, so you will know who he was. He did not want to be in the war. He wanted to be a teacher, to work with children, to help them learn about the world. But the war came, and he had to fight. He was kind to everyone, even his enemies when he could be. He never spoke with hate about American pilots. He said they were just young men like him, far from home, trying to do their duty. I cannot say that what you did was right, but I understand why you did it. Klaus wrote to me about how hard it was to remain good when so much around him was bad. He struggled, as I think you struggle. Perhaps this is what war does to all good men, it makes them do things they never thought they would do. I do not forgive you for killing my husband, because some things are too big for forgiveness. But I do not hate you either. I hope that when this war is over, you will be able to make peace with what you have done. I hope you will live a good life, because that is what Klaus would have wanted. He always said that the best way to honor the dead is to live well. Please do not write to me again. It is too painful to think about these things. But I wanted you to know that Klaus was a good man, and that he died far from home, thinking about his wife and son. The letter was signed simply, Anna Weber, Munich, 1944. Charles read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully. Anna Weber's words hit him harder than expected. Her pain was clear in every sentence, but so was her dignity and refusal to let hatred consume her. She had chosen to see Charles as another young man caught in war's machinery rather than as a monster who had murdered her husband. ***. Her words about Klaus wanting to be a teacher were particularly painful. ***. Charles tried to imagine the German pilot in a classroom, helping children learn about geography or history, living a quiet life of service. Instead, Klaus Weber had died in a burning aircraft over France, killed by an American pilot who had let anger override mercy. Bad news from home. Captain Morrison had noticed Charles's serious expression. No. Good news, I think. Or at least, complicated news. Charles handed Morrison the letter. This is from the wife of that German pilot I shot down. Morrison read carefully, his expression thoughtful. When he finished, he handed it back. She's a remarkable woman. She is. And her husband was probably a remarkable man too. How does that make you feel? Charles considered the question. Worse and better at the same time. Worse because I know exactly what I took from the world. Better because she doesn't hate me for it. Do you hate yourself for it? Charles thought about that question. Did he hate himself? He wasn't proud of what he'd done, wasn't pleased with his choices. But hate seemed too simple for something so complicated. I don't know if hate is the right word. I'm disappointed. In myself, in the war, in how good people can be pushed to do terrible things. Klaus Weber wanted to be a teacher, and I wanted to be a farmer. Instead, he became a fighter pilot, and I became a killer. The war made us both into something we never intended to be. And what do you intend to be now? Charles looked at Anna Weber's letter again, reading her words about living well as a way to honor the dead. I want to be the kind of man Klaus Weber might have been if he'd lived. Someone who tries to build instead of destroy, someone who protects instead of kills, someone who teaches instead of fights. Think you can do that? I have to try. I owe it to him, to his wife and son, to all the people who didn't come home. I have to try to be worthy of the life I got to keep. That night, Charles slept better than he had in weeks, not because his burden had been lifted but because he finally understood how to carry it, feel the rhythm of the ship's engines carrying Charles home across the Atlantic, like a lullaby rocking you toward peaceful dreams. 2 weeks later, Charles received orders to return to the United States. The war in Europe was winding down. The Allies had established a foothold in France and were pushing the German army back on all fronts. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Democracy would triumph over fascism, and the world would begin healing from the worst war in human history. Charles packed his belongings, including Anna Weber's letter and Klaus Weber's unfinished letter that intelligence had given him. He said goodbye to Captain Morrison and the other pilots staying behind. He took one last look at Buckeye Bell, knowing someone else would fly her now. The journey home took 5 days, a troopship across the Atlantic, crowded with soldiers and airmen eager to see their families. Charles spent most of the voyage on deck, watching the ocean and thinking about the future. He was 23, a veteran of 50 combat missions, a decorated pilot with 17 confirmed kills and a chest full of medals. He could go home to Ohio as a hero, marry a local girl, take over his father's farm, and live the quiet life he'd dreamed about, but Charles knew the quiet life wouldn't be possible until he'd found a way to make peace with what he'd done. Anna Weber had given him a path forward, to live well, to honor the dead through the choices he made as a living man. But knowing the path and walking it were different things. When Charles arrived in New York Harbor and saw the Statue of Liberty rising from the water, he felt the same mixture of joy and sadness thousands of returning veterans were feeling. Joy at being home, at having survived. Sadness for friends who hadn't made it back, for experiences that had changed them in ways their families might never understand. Let the motion of the ship on waves rock you deeper into sleep, like a gentle lullaby carrying you toward home. Charles's mother was waiting at the Columbus train station, just as he'd known she would be. She looked older, more fragile, but her smile was the same one that had sent him off to war 3 years earlier. She hugged him tightly, and Charles could smell her familiar perfume mixed with soap from working in the garden. "Welcome home, son," she whispered. "Welcome home." Charles held her for a long time, feeling the solid reality of home and family in a world where people didn't shoot at each other from flying machines. For the first time since watching Klaus Weber fall to his death, Charles felt something that might have been peace, but he knew peace would have to be earned through the choices he made in years ahead, through the man he chose to become rather than the man the war had made him. The journey home was over, but Charles Chappell's real journey, toward redemption, was just beginning. Charles's homecoming was everything small-town America knew how to provide for its returning heroes. There was a parade down Main Street, with Charles riding in a convertible while the high school band played patriotic songs and people waved small American flags. The mayor gave a speech about sacrifice and service and the debt the community owed to young men like Charles. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the hometown boy who had become a fighter ace. Charles smiled and waved and said the right things, but inside he felt like he was watching someone else's life. The hero they were celebrating wasn't the man he knew himself to be. The hero had never shot down a helpless enemy pilot trying to escape his burning aircraft. The hero had never learned that good and evil were more complicated than speeches made them sound. Allow the discomfort of Charles's homecoming to contrast with your own peaceful rest, feeling grateful for the safety of your own bed. The questions were the hardest part. Everyone wanted war stories, tales of aerial combat and heroic victories. They wanted him to confirm their understanding of the war as a simple conflict between good and bad, a story with clear heroes and obvious villains. Charles tried to give them what they wanted without lying outright. He told stories about the P-51 Mustang, about aerial combat tactics, about the courage of bomber crews. But he never talked about Klaus Weber, or Anna Weber's letter, or the weight of choices that seemed right at the time but felt wrong in retrospect. "What was your most memorable mission, son?" asked Mr. Henderson, who had lost his own boy in the Pacific. Charles knew the answer immediately: his final mission, the one that had ended his flying career and changed his understanding of himself. But he couldn't tell Mr. Henderson about that mission. "They're all memorable," Charles said instead. "You remember them all because you never know which one might be your last." It was true, as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth. Charles was learning that coming home from war meant living with two kinds of truth: the truth you told other people and the truth you told yourself. Feel the complexity of truth settling around you like layers of blankets, each one adding warmth to your growing drowsiness. Charles moved back into his childhood bedroom, sleeping in the same bed where he dreamed of adventure when he was 17. Now, at 23, those dreams felt like artifacts from someone else's childhood. His father wanted him to take over the farm eventually. Charles loved the farm, the smell of fresh earth, the satisfaction of planting and harvesting, the rhythm of seasons that had nothing to do with war or death. But farming felt too easy now, too comfortable, too removed from the weight he carried. Klaus Weber had wanted to be a teacher, had wanted to work with children and help them understand the world. Charles began to think that maybe teaching was a way he could honor Weber's memory while finding purpose for his own life. "Teaching," his mother said when Charles mentioned the possibility. "But you have the farm. You have a future here." "The farm will always be here, Mom. But right now, I think I need to do something else. Something that might make a difference." She studied his face, trying to understand the changes the war had made in her son. She'd expected him to come home the same boy who'd left, perhaps older and more experienced, but fundamentally unchanged. Instead, she was dealing with a man who carried invisible wounds and spoke in half-finished sentences about responsibility and redemption. "What kind of difference?" she asked. Charles thought about Klaus Weber's son, growing up in Germany without a father. He thought about all the children who would grow up in a world shaped by violence and hatred. He thought about the need to teach the next generation how to be better than the one that had just torn the world apart. "I want to teach children about the world. About history and geography and the way different people live. I want to help them understand that the world is bigger and more complicated than they know, but that it's also full of good people trying to do right. But Charles knew that settling down wasn't possible until he'd found a way to settle the debt he owed to the man he'd killed. That autumn, Charles enrolled in the education program at Ohio State University. He was older than most students, and his experiences had given him a perspective that sometimes made classroom discussions feel abstract. When his history professor talked about the causes of World War I, Charles thought about Klaus Weber's letter to his wife. When his education professor discussed classroom discipline, Charles thought about the discipline it took to make moral choices under pressure, but he was a good student, motivated by something deeper than grades or career prospects. Every paper he wrote, every test he took, every lesson he planned was a step toward becoming the kind of teacher Klaus Weber might have been. It was Charles's way of keeping faith with a dead enemy who had become, in a strange way, one of his most important teachers. Charles also began corresponding with other veterans, men he'd served with who were struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life. They wrote letters back and forth, sharing their experiences and their fears and their hopes. It was informal therapy, a way of processing experiences that civilian counselors couldn't understand and families didn't want to hear about. Let the image of Charles writing letters by lamplight carry you deeper into peaceful sleep, the scratch of pen on paper a lullaby from a quieter time. During his second year of college, Charles met Sarah Mitchell, a young woman studying to be a nurse. Sarah was smart and kind and patient, and she seemed to understand that Charles was carrying something heavy without needing to know all the details. They began spending time together, studying in the library, taking walks around campus, talking about their plans for the future. Sarah knew that Charles had been a pilot in the war, but she didn't ask for war stories or press him for details about his combat experience. She seemed to sense that those memories were still too raw, too complicated, for casual conversation. Instead, she asked about his plans to become a teacher, about the kind of classroom he wanted to have, about the ways he hoped to make a difference in children's lives. "Why teaching?" she asked one autumn evening as they walked through campus in golden sunset light. Charles had been asked that question many times, but he'd never given the complete answer. With Sarah, for the first time, he found himself telling the truth. "I knew someone during the war who wanted to be a teacher. He never got the chance, and I think I owe it to him to try to be the kind of teacher he might have been." Sarah was quiet for a moment, understanding there was more to the story but not pushing for details. "Tell me about him." So Charles told her about Klaus Weber, leaving out the details of how Weber had died but explaining about the unfinished letter, about the dream of teaching children, about the wife and son who had been left behind. He told her about Anna Weber's letter and her challenge to live well as a way of honoring the dead. Feel the trust between Charles and Sarah like a warm blanket, the safety of sharing difficult truths with someone who understands. He sounds like he was a good man, Sarah said when Charles had finished. "I think he was. I'll never know for sure, but, yes, I think he was a good man caught up in a bad situation, trying to do his duty and get home to his family." "And you think becoming a teacher is a way to honor his memory?" Charles nodded. "Among other things. I think Klaus Weber would want me to help children understand that the world is full of people just like them, people who love their families and want good things for their children. I think he'd want me to teach them that war happens when we forget how much we have in common with people who seem different from us." Sarah took Charles's hand as they walked. "That's a beautiful way to remember him." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Charles felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that he might be able to build a life worthy of the life he'd been allowed to keep. With Sarah beside him and Klaus Weber's memory guiding him, he began to believe that redemption might be possible after all. But Charles knew that the real test would come when he stood in front of his first classroom, trying to be the teacher Klaus Weber had never gotten the chance to become. ***3 years after returning from the war. Charles Chappell stood in front of his first classroom at Roosevelt Elementary School in Columbus, Ohio. 28 7-year-olds stared up at him with the mixture of curiosity and skepticism that children reserve for new teachers. Charles looked back at them and saw the future, not just their individual futures, but the future of a world that would be shaped by how well he and teachers like him could help the next generation learn from the mistakes of the previous one. Settle into the warm atmosphere of a classroom, feeling the safety and hope that schools represent, the promise of learning and growth and second chances. Good morning, class, Charles said, his voice steadier than he felt. My name is Mr. Chappell, and I'm going to be your teacher this year. We're going to learn about many things together, reading and writing and arithmetic, of course, but also about the world we live in and the people who share it with us. A small girl in the front row raised her hand. Mr. Chappell, were you in the war? Charles had been expecting this question, but it still caught him off guard. Children were direct in ways adults had learned not to be. They asked the questions that mattered without worrying about whether the answers might be uncomfortable. Yes, Susan. I was in the war. Did you kill people? The classroom fell silent. Charles could feel 28 pairs of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would handle the question that adults whispered about but children asked aloud. He thought about Klaus Weber, about Anna Weber's letter, about the weight of truth and the responsibility of teaching. War is a complicated thing, Susan. Sometimes people have to make very difficult choices to protect the people they love. But I hope that you and your children and your children's children never have to face those kinds of choices. That's one of the reasons we study history, so we can learn from the past and make better decisions in the future. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was an honest one, appropriate for 7-year-olds who were just beginning to understand that the world was more complex than their own experience suggested. The questions children asked were often the hardest ones to answer, but also the most important. As the weeks passed, Charles discovered that teaching was both easier and harder than he'd expected. The mechanics of it, lesson planning, classroom management, grading papers, came naturally to him. He had a talent for explaining complex ideas in simple terms, for making abstract concepts concrete through stories and examples. The children liked him, trusted him, and seemed to genuinely enjoy learning, but the emotional weight of teaching was heavier than Charles had anticipated. Every time he looked at his students, he thought about Klaus Weber's son, now 4 years old, growing up in post-war Germany without his father. He wondered what kind of teacher Klaus would have been, what lessons he would have taught, what wisdom he might have passed on to the next generation. Charles found himself incorporating Klaus's memory into his teaching in subtle ways. When they studied geography, he made sure the children understood that Germany was full of regular people, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, who loved their families just like American families did. When they studied history, he emphasized that wars usually happen because people stopped seeing their enemies as human beings with hopes and dreams similar to their own. People everywhere want the same basic things, Charles told his class one November afternoon as they discussed different countries around the world. They want to keep their families safe, they want their children to have good lives, they want enough food to eat and a comfortable place to sleep. Sometimes we forget that people in other countries are just like us, and that's when problems start. Tommy, a red-haired boy who sat in the back row, raised his hand. But Mr. Chappell, if people everywhere are the same, why do they fight wars? It was exactly the kind of question Charles hoped his students would ask, but it was also one of the hardest to answer without getting into complexities that 7-year-olds weren't ready to handle. That's a very good question, Tommy. I think wars happen when people get scared and stop listening to each other. When they decide that the differences between them are more important than the things they have in common. When they forget that their enemies are human beings with feelings and families, just like them. Let Charles's wisdom with his students inspire your own journey toward peaceful sleep, feeling the comfort that comes from truth gently shared. Sarah, who had become a regular presence in Charles's life and was now wearing his engagement ring, sometimes visited the classroom after school to help with grading or to prepare materials for the next day's lessons. She understood the importance of Charles's work, not just as education but as a form of healing and redemption. "You're a natural teacher," she told him one evening as they worked together to create a bulletin board display about different countries around the world. "The children love you, and they're learning more than just facts and figures. They're learning how to think about the world in a different way." "I hope so. I keep thinking about the children in Germany, the ones who grew up during the war, the ones who are trying to understand why their country did terrible things. I wonder if their teachers are helping them learn the same lessons I'm trying to teach here." Sarah looked up from the map she was cutting out. "Do you ever think about writing to her again?" To Klaus Weber's wife. Charles had been thinking about Anna Weber more frequently as he'd settled into his teaching role. He wondered how she was managing in post-war Germany, whether she'd remarried, how her son was doing. He'd drafted several letters over the years but had never sent them, honoring her request that he not contact her again. "Sometimes I wonder if she'd want to know that I kept my promise, that I'm trying to live the kind of life that might honor Klaus's memory. But she asked me not to write, and I think I owe her that respect. Maybe someday she'll change her mind. Maybe someday she'll want to know how her husband's death affected the person who was responsible for it." Charles nodded, still focused on the bulletin board. He'd learned to live with uncertainty about many things: Anna Weber's feelings, Klaus Weber's true character, his own capacity for redemption. Teaching was helping him understand that some questions didn't have clear answers, and that wisdom lay in learning how to live productively with ambiguity. As the school year progressed, Charles began to see that teaching wasn't just about passing on knowledge, it was about helping children develop the capacity to think critically and compassionately about a complex world. One of Charles's most challenging students was Mary, a quiet girl whose father had been killed in the Pacific. Mary rarely spoke in class, rarely participated in group activities, and often seemed lost in her own thoughts. Charles recognized the signs of grief and loss that adults sometimes missed in children, the way trauma could manifest as withdrawal rather than obvious distress. Charles began paying special attention to Mary, giving her extra encouragement, creating opportunities for her to succeed in small ways that might build her confidence. He also began incorporating lessons about loss and healing into his teaching, helping all his students understand that sadness was a normal part of life and that talking about difficult feelings was healthier than keeping them bottled up inside. "It's okay to miss people who aren't with us anymore," Charles told the class one day when Mary had seemed particularly withdrawn. "Missing people we love is one way we keep them alive in our hearts. The people who love us want us to remember them, but they also want us to be happy and to live good lives." Mary looked up at Charles with tears in her eyes, and Charles could see that his words had reached her in a way that months of gentle encouragement hadn't. After class, she stayed behind to talk to him. "Mr. Chappell, do you think my daddy knows that I miss him?" Charles knelt down so that he was at eye level with Mary. "I think he knows, sweetheart. And I think he wants you to miss him because that means you loved him. But I also think he wants you to be happy and to learn new things and to make friends and to grow up to be the wonderful person he always knew you could be." Mary nodded solemnly. "Do you miss people from the war?" The question hit Charles like a physical blow. He thought about Klaus Weber, about Billy Thompson, about all the friends who hadn't come home. He thought about the complicated nature of missing someone you'd killed, someone whose death had changed your understanding of yourself and the world. "Yes, Mary. I miss several people from the war. Some were friends of mine, and some were people I wish I could have known better. Missing them helps me remember that every person's life is important and precious. Feel the tenderness between teacher and student, the way that sharing grief can lead to healing and understanding. Mary began to participate more actively in class after that conversation. She still had quiet days, times when the weight of her loss seemed particularly heavy, but she also had moments of joy and curiosity and engagement with the world around her. Charles saw her transformation as evidence that teaching could indeed be a form of healing, both for students and for teachers who carried their own invisible wounds. As spring approached, Charles decided to plan a special unit on international pen-pal relationships. He'd arranged for his class to exchange letters with children in England, giving his American students a chance to learn about life in another country while practicing their writing skills. The project was designed to help the children understand that people everywhere had similar hopes and dreams, regardless of their nationality or the language they spoke. The first letters from the English children arrived in March, full of news about school and family and daily life in post-war Britain. Charles's students were fascinated to learn that children in England played similar games, worried about similar things, and had similar dreams for their futures. The project was accomplishing exactly what Charles had hoped it would, helping his students see people in other countries as individuals rather than as abstract foreigners. But as Charles read through the English children's letters, he found himself thinking about other pen-pal relationships that might be possible. What if American children could exchange letters with German children? What if students on both sides of the former conflict could learn about each other's lives and develop the kind of understanding that might prevent future wars? It was a radical idea for 1948, but Charles believed that children were more open-minded than adults, more capable of seeing past nationality and politics to the human beings underneath. That evening, Charles sat down at his kitchen table and began drafting a letter to the superintendent of schools, outlining his proposal for an international pen-pal program that would include German schools. He wrote about the educational benefits of such an exchange, about the importance of teaching children that former enemies could become friends, about the role that schools could play in building a more peaceful world. But as he wrote, Charles found himself thinking about another letter he might write, a letter to Anna Weber, telling her about his teaching career and his efforts to honor Klaus's memory through education. 3 years had passed since she'd asked him not to contact her again. Perhaps enough time had passed. Perhaps she might want to know that the American pilot who had killed her husband was trying to become the kind of teacher her husband had wanted to be. Charles finished his letter to the superintendent, then pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing to Anna Weber. If she didn't want to hear from him, she could simply not respond. But if there was a chance that his words might provide some small comfort, some evidence that Klaus's death had led to something positive in the world, then Charles felt obligated to try. Let the hope in Charles's letterwriting carry you deeper into sleep, feeling the possibility that even the worst mistakes might be transformed into something meaningful and good. Anna Weber's second letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in May, delivered to Charles's classroom just as his students were settling in for their arithmetic lesson. Charles recognized the careful handwriting immediately, and his hands trembled as he opened the envelope. 3 years had passed since Anna had asked him not to write to her again, and Charles had begun to think that his recent letter had been a mistake. Breathe deeply and feel yourself settling into the story like sinking into a favorite chair, surrounded by the familiar comfort of Charles's classroom. Dear Mr. Chappell, Anna's letter began, I was surprised to receive your letter, but I am glad you wrote to me. 3 years is a long time, and I have had time to think about many things, including your role in Klaus's death and what it means for both of us to live with that knowledge. I want to tell you about Klaus's son, who is now 7 years old. His name is Klaus Jr., but we call him Klauschen. He is bright and curious and asks many questions about his father. I have told him that his father was a pilot who died in the war, but I have not told him how he died or who was responsible. Perhaps someday I will tell him about your letters, about the American pilot who cared enough to write to his father's widow. You write about becoming a teacher, about trying to honor Klaus's memory by educating children. This touches my heart because Klaus often spoke of his dreams to teach. He would be pleased, I think, to know that someone is fulfilling the dream he could not complete himself. In a strange way, his death has created a teacher where there might not have been one otherwise. I must tell you that life in Germany has been very difficult since the war. We have little food, little fuel, and many of our cities are still in ruins. Klauschen goes to school in a building that is half destroyed, and his teachers are trying to help German children understand what their country did wrong and how to build a better future. Perhaps this is why your letter means more to me now than it would have 3 years ago. In Germany, we are learning that we must face the truth about what we did, about the terrible things that were done in our name. We must teach our children to be better than we were, to choose peace over war, understanding over hatred. It seems that you are trying to teach the same lessons to American children. You ask about forgiveness, and I must be honest with you. I cannot say that I forgive you for Klaus's death, because the pain of losing him is still too great. But I can say that I no longer hate you for it. I understand now that you were a young man far from home, trying to do your duty in a terrible situation. Klaus was the same kind of young man, fighting for his country, trying to survive long enough to come home to his family. War made you enemies, but in another time, you might have been friends. I have a request to make of you. You write about teaching children to understand that people in other countries are human beings with families and dreams similar to their own. Would you be willing to tell your students about Klaus, about the German pilot who wanted to be a teacher? Would you tell them about Klauschen, the little boy in Germany who is learning English and who dreams of visiting America someday? If you are willing to do this, I would like to tell Klauschen about you, about the American teacher who knew his father. Perhaps someday, when he is older, he might write to you himself. Perhaps the son of the man you killed and the man who killed his father might become friends. This would not erase what happened, but it might create something good from something terrible. With respect and cautious hope, Anna Weber, Munich, Germany, 1948. Charles read the letter 3 times, then sat down heavily at his desk. Anna's words hit him with a mixture of relief, gratitude, and renewed responsibility. She was offering him something precious, the chance to honor Klaus Weber's memory in a direct and meaningful way, the opportunity to help build bridges between former enemies through the honest sharing of human stories, but she was also challenging him to do something that might be controversial, even dangerous to his career. Telling his American students about Klaus Weber would mean revealing details about the war that many parents might not want their children to hear. It would mean asking 7-year-olds to see a German pilot as a human being rather than as an enemy. Charles looked around his classroom, at the maps and books and children's artwork that covered the walls, at the desks where 28 young Americans sat every day learning about the world they were inheriting. These children would be adults in the 1960s and 1970s, the leaders and decision-makers of the future. What they learned now about war and peace, about former enemies and the possibility of friendship, might determine whether the next generation would be wiser than the one that had just finished tearing the world apart. Feel the weight of responsibility settling around Charles like a teacher's robe, the knowledge that education shapes the future in ways both large and small. That evening, Charles showed Anna's letter to Sarah. They were planning their wedding for the following summer, and Sarah had become his closest advisor on both personal and professional matters. "She's asking a lot of you," Sarah said after reading the letter. "Telling your students about Klaus Weber means revealing parts of your war experience that you've kept private. Are you ready for that?" Charles had been thinking about the same question since he'd first read Anna's letter. Keeping Klaus Weber's story private had protected Charles from uncomfortable questions and allowed him to maintain the image of a war hero that his community preferred. But it had also kept him isolated with his guilt and his grief, unable to share the full truth about what the war had cost him and what it had taught him. I think I have to be ready. Anna's right that Klaus would want American children to know that German children are just children, not enemies. And I think my students are old enough to understand that war is more complicated than the good guys versus bad guys stories they've been told. What about the parents? What about the school board? Charles knew that Sarah was asking the right questions, the practical questions that could affect his career and their future together. If parents complained, if the school board decided that his teaching was inappropriate or unpatriotic, Charles could lose his job. I don't know if they're ready, Charles admitted. But I know that if we wait for people to be ready for reconciliation, we might wait forever. Someone has to be willing to take the first step, to say that former enemies can become friends, that understanding is more important than continuing old hatreds. And you think that someone should be you? Charles looked at Anna's letter again, reading her words about Klaus Jr. learning English and dreaming of visiting America someday. I think I owe it to Klaus Weber to try. I think I owe it to his son, and to Anna, and to all the children who are growing up in a world shaped by the war. The next morning, Charles stood in front of his class and began the most important lesson of his teaching career. Today I want to tell you about someone I knew during the war, Charles began, his voice steady despite his nervousness. His name was Klaus Weber, and he was a German pilot. Before the war, he wanted to be a teacher, just like me. He wanted to work with children and help them learn about the world. A hand shot up immediately. But Mr. Chappell, wasn't he a bad guy? Wasn't he fighting against us? Charles had expected this question. That's a very good question, Tommy. Klaus Weber was fighting for Germany, just like I was fighting for America. But that didn't make him a bad person. He was just a young man who loved his country and was trying to do his duty, the same way American pilots were trying to do theirs. Did you meet him during the war? Asked Susan. Charles took a deep breath. This was the moment when he would either honor Anna Weber's request or retreat into the comfortable distance of official war stories. In a way, yes. I shot down his aircraft during an air battle over France. The classroom fell silent. Charles could see the children processing this information, trying to understand how their teacher could have killed someone and still be talking about that person with respect and sadness. Was he trying to hurt you? Mary asked quietly. We were fighting each other, Mary. We were both trying to do our jobs as pilots, trying to protect our friends and our countries. But after the war, I learned that Klaus Weber had a wife and a little boy, just like some of your fathers have families. His little boy is about your age now, and he's going to school in Germany and learning English. Charles pulled out a world map and pointed to Germany. Klaus Weber's son is named Klaus Jr., but his mother calls him Klauschen. That's a German nickname, like calling someone Little Klaus. Klauschen goes to school just like you do, and he studies arithmetic and reading and geography. He asks questions about his father, who died in the war before Klauschen was old enough to remember him. Allow the gentle sadness of this story to wash over you like a lullaby, feeling the peace that comes from understanding rather than hatred. Is Klauschen sad that his daddy died? Asked Mary, who understood loss in ways that most 7-year-olds didn't. Yes, Mary. He's sad, just like you're sad about your daddy. But his mother is helping him understand that his father was a good man who loved his family and wanted to make the world better for children like Klauschen. Charles could see that his students were beginning to understand the lesson he was trying to teach, that children everywhere were basically the same, regardless of their nationality, and that the casualties of war included families and dreams as well as soldiers and pilots. The reason I'm telling you about Klaus Weber and his son is that I want you to understand something important about the world. There are children in every country, Germany, Japan, France, England, everywhere, who are just like you. They love their families, they want to learn new things, they play games and have favorite foods and worry about the same kinds of things you worry about. When grown-ups fight wars, it's easy to forget that the people on the other side are human beings with feelings and families, just like us. Over the following weeks, Charles continued to incorporate lessons about reconciliation and understanding into his regular curriculum. The response from parents was mixed, as Charles had expected. Some were supportive of his efforts to teach tolerance and understanding. Others were concerned that he was being too soft on former enemies. A few parents requested meetings with Charles to discuss his teaching methods, but Charles also received unexpected support from other veterans in the community. Captain Jim Morrison attended one of the parent meetings where Charles's teaching methods were being discussed, and his words carried weight. "I flew with Charles Chappell for over a year," Morrison told the gathered parents. "I saw him in combat, and I know what kind of man he is. If Charles thinks it's important for children to learn about forgiveness and reconciliation, then I trust his judgment. Those of us who fought in the war know better than anyone that hatred is a luxury we can't afford if we want to prevent future wars." Let the support of fellow veterans wrap around Charles like a warm blanket, the understanding that comes from shared experience. The school board ultimately decided to support Charles's teaching methods, with the understanding that he would notify parents in advance when discussing sensitive topics related to the war. Charles was grateful for this compromise, which allowed him to continue his work while respecting the concerns of parents who weren't ready for their children to hear complex truths about former enemies. As the school year drew to a close, Charles received another letter from Anna Weber. This one included a photograph of Klaus Jr., a serious-looking boy with his father's eyes and his mother's gentle smile. Anna wrote that she had told Klauschen about the American teacher who had known his father, and that the boy was excited about the possibility of someday writing to Charles himself. "Klauschen asks many questions about America," Anna wrote. "He wants to know what American schools are like, what games American children play, what they learn about Germany in their history lessons. I think he is beginning to understand that Americans are not his enemies, just as I hope American children are learning that German children are not theirs. Perhaps this is how peace begins, one child, one conversation, one letter at a time." Charles showed the photograph to his students, and they were delighted to see the face of the German boy they had been hearing about all year. Several children asked if they could write letters to Klauschen, and Charles promised to explore the possibility of establishing a formal pen-pal relationship between his class and a German school. **** As Charles looked at the photograph of Klaus Weber's son, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope for a future where former enemies might become friends. ***. 5 years later, Charles Chappell stood in his classroom reading a letter that had just arrived from Germany. It was written in careful English by Klaus Weber Jr., now 12 years old and eager to correspond with his father's former enemy who had become a teacher and, in a strange way, a guardian of his father's memory. Feel yourself drifting into the peaceful conclusion of this long story, like settling into a comfortable chair after a journey. Dear Mr. Chappell, the letter began. My mother has told me about you and about my father. She says you were the one who shot down his airplane, but that you have tried to honor his memory by becoming the kind of teacher he wanted to be. I would like to be your friend, if you would like to be mine. I have many questions about America, and I hope someday I can visit your country and see your school. Charles smiled as he read the letter. It was signed, Klaus Weber Jr., but my friends call me Klaus, and I hope you will too. Over the years, Charles had received dozens of letters from Klaus Jr., watching him grow up through his words, helping him practice his English, sharing stories about American children and American schools. The correspondence had grown into exactly what Anna Weber had hoped it might become, a bridge across the chasm that war had created, proof that understanding could grow even in the most unlikely soil. Sarah, now Charles's wife, often helped him write responses to Klaus's letters. She had never met Klaus Weber, but she understood that the German pilot's memory was woven into the fabric of her husband's life, that honoring that memory was part of what made Charles the teacher and man he had become. He wants to know if he can come to America for a summer exchange program when he turns 16, Sarah said, looking over Charles's shoulder as he read Klaus's latest letter. What do you think? Charles thought about the boy whose father he had killed, the boy who was now eager to visit America and meet the man who had become, in a strange way, a connection to the father he had never known. It seemed impossible, the idea that Klaus Weber Jr. might someday walk into Charles's classroom, shake hands with the man who had made him fatherless, and call him friend, but perhaps that was exactly the kind of impossible thing the world needed more of. I think, Charles said slowly, that his father would be proud of the young man he's becoming. And I think maybe it's time for Klaus to see for himself that former enemies can indeed become friends. Feel the hope and healing in Charles's final words carrying you into peaceful sleep, knowing that even in the darkest times, redemption and understanding remain possible. Charles sat down at his desk and began to write his response to Klaus Weber Jr., inviting him to America, to his classroom, to a future where the sons of former enemies might build the peace their father's generation had fought so hard to win. As he wrote, Charles thought about Anna Weber's words from so many years ago. Perhaps this is how peace begins, one child, one conversation, one letter at a time. Outside his classroom window, American children were playing games in the schoolyard, their laughter carrying on the spring air. Somewhere in Germany, Klaus Weber Jr. was probably playing similar games with children who spoke a different language but shared the same dreams. The world was still complicated, still full of conflicts and misunderstandings, but it was also full of teachers like Charles who were working quietly to help the next generation do better than the one before. Charles finished his letter, sealed it in an envelope, and prepared to mail it across the ocean to a boy whose life had been shaped by war but who might help shape a future defined by peace. It wasn't much, perhaps, one letter, one friendship, one small act of reconciliation in a world that needed many more such acts, but as Anna Weber had understood years ago, peace didn't come all at once in grand gestures. It came slowly, quietly, one choice at a time, built by people who were willing to see former enemies as future friends, who were willing to plant seeds of understanding in ground that had been scorched by conflict, and sometimes, if you were patient enough, if you tended those seeds with care and hope and the kind of love that transcends nationality and politics and the bitter divisions of the past, they grew into something beautiful. Charles Chappell had learned to sleep peacefully again, not because he had forgotten what he had done during the war, but because he had found a way to transform that dark chapter into something that honored both the dead and the living. In teaching Klaus Weber's son about America, in sharing Klaus Weber's story with his students, in building bridges across the chasm that war had created, Charles had found his own form of redemption. Let Charles's journey from guilt to grace carry you into your own peaceful sleep, feeling the comfort that comes from knowing that even our worst mistakes can be transformed into something meaningful and good. The last thing Charles did before leaving his classroom that day was to add Klaus Weber Jr.'s letter to the collection he kept in his desk drawer, dozens of letters exchanged between a German boy and an American teacher, between the son of a man who had died in war and the man who had killed him. They were letters full of questions about each other's countries, dreams for the future, and the slow, careful building of a friendship that would have seemed impossible in 1944 but which had become, by 1953, one of the most precious things in both their lives. As Charles walked home to Sarah that evening, he thought about Klaus Weber Sr., the young German pilot who had wanted to be a teacher, who had written love letters to his wife, who had dreamed of holding his son for the first time. Klaus would never get to see how his son turned out, would never know that the American pilot who had killed him had spent years trying to become the kind of teacher Klaus had wanted to be, but perhaps, somehow, Klaus knew anyway. Perhaps the dead could see the future they had helped to shape through their sacrifice, could understand that even senseless deaths might lead to meaningful lives for those who survived them. Charles chose to believe that Klaus Weber would approve of the friendship growing between his son and his killer, would see it as proof that understanding could triumph over hatred, that peace could grow even in soil watered by blood and tears. And perhaps that was all any of them could do, plant seeds of understanding wherever they found themselves, tend them with patience and hope, and trust that someday, somehow, they would grow into the kind of world worth dying for, worth living for, worth passing on to the children who would inherit whatever future the adults of the world chose to build. Sleep peacefully now, letting Charles's story of redemption and hope carry you into dreams of a world where former enemies become friends, where understanding conquers hatred, and where even the darkest chapters of history can be transformed into lessons of light. Rest well, knowing that like Charles Chappell, we all have the power to transform our mistakes into meaningful action, our regrets into wisdom, and our darkest moments into the foundation for a brighter future. Sleep peacefully, and let tomorrow bring new opportunities for understanding, forgiveness, and the quiet heroism of choosing compassion over hatred.